She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it cost her her life. Hello, true crimerers. This is another true crime in a short amount of time, and it is the case of Alexandra Zapp. Viewer discretion is advised. Alexandra Nicole Zapp, who would go by Allie to everyone in her life, she was born on August 24th, 1971, and she was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. After graduating high school, she would attend the University of Oregon, where she spent about 2 years. And then I guess she accepted some kind of editing position that was in Boston, Massachusetts, and so she moved, basically almost across the country. Allie was the type of person who always thought of others before she ever thought of herself. She was a very, very charitable person. She dedicated a lot of her time and donated financially to several charity organizations. She also loves sailing, and not only did she love sailing, she loved to teach people how to sail. She actually volunteered at the Courageous Sailing Center, and she taught children about sailing. She also would donate money and her time at the Boston Ballet. Her love of sailing is ultimately what would bring her to Newport, Rhode Island, where she accepted a new job, I guess with a company called US Sailing. She did that for some time, and then at the time that this story actually takes place, she was making plans and all the preparations to actually move to New Zealand for a sailing opportunity. And I guess it was going to be on the America's Cup boat. On July 18th, 2002, Allie was in Boston for a charity event. And then when the charity event was over, she was going to be driving back home to Rhode Island. On the way to Rhode Island, she stopped at a rest stop. This was on Route 24, and the rest stop was also a part of like a Burger King restaurant. So she had stopped in, I believe, to just use the restroom. And so she walked through the Burger King entrance and then walked into the ladies' room. A short time later, there was a gentleman in the men's room who heard some scuffling and like a muffled scream coming from a woman that he believed was coming from the ladies' room. The man, the witness, was named Stephen O'Reilly. He just so happened to be a police lieutenant who at that time was just off duty. He approached the women's room and he saw what looked like a little bit of blood kind of coming out from underneath the door. And so he took his gun out and he slowly opened the door. And when he did, he saw a relatively large man standing next to the sink, covered in blood. And on the ground was the body of a female. And she was covered in blood and lying in pools of blood. So at that point, Lieutenant O'Reilly arrests this man who did this, calls an ambulance, calls first responders. Unfortunately, the woman on the ground was already deceased. That woman was Alexandra Allie Zapp. Alexandra had been stabbed not just once or twice, but many, many times. She had stab wounds to her arms, to her chest, and around her neck. This was a violent, vicious attack. So who was the man? Well, his name was Paul Leahy. Paul Leahy was an employee of the Burger King at that rest stop. Essentially, he was arrested. He was brought in for questioning, and at first he said he didn't do anything. He had just stabbed her in the arm, and then that's it. But then they said, well, we can tell you that she was stabbed many more times, including in the chest. And that's when he kind of came clean and said, okay, I stabbed her there too. He was an employee at the Burger King, and he said he had just happened to see Allie walk into the Burger King, and he just immediately thought to himself, I need to go do something. What his intentions truly were it to rob or sexually assault, murder? It's not exactly clear, but he then watched her go into the bathroom, and then he left, the kitchen area of the Burger King, walked in front of the ladies' room and just stood there and waited for Allie to open the door. When she did, he was there blocking the door, holding a knife, and then he forced her back into the bathroom. And then he just stabbed her. Again, for what reasons? He didn't sexually assault her, and there was no attempt, at least, to steal anything. Despite later on his lawyers, who wouldn't deny that he killed her, his lawyers would eventually say, basically, well, the intent was just to rob her and things just got out of hand. And so that's why he did what he did. But there was never any evidence to show that he had tried to steal anything. The evidence against him was incredibly overwhelming because you had this police officer who literally caught him in the women's room, literally red-handed, like with blood on his hands, covered in blood with a knife and everything. It was clear it was him. Paul Leahy had a history, believe it or not, a very violent history, dating all the way back to the 80s. He had multiple run-ins with the law. He had convictions of sexual assault, and several of his victims were under the age of 18. His youngest victim was about 13 years old. There, I guess at the time, wasn't necessarily strict laws in place to prevent people like him from working in certain places, and you know the drill. People with like a history of sexual assaults, at least here, well, we don't always necessarily keep a very watchful eye on them, you know, from a legal standpoint. But the fact of the matter is he was employed by this restaurant. He saw a woman and he attacked her and murdered her for his own unknown reasons, but he did it. A man forced a woman back into the women's room and just brutally killed her. So he would go on trial, and on September 24th, 2003, Paul Leahy was found guilty of the murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Allie's mom and Allie's mom's, I guess, newer husband, they had moved from Portland to Boston after all of this happened. And in Boston, they founded something called the Allie Foundation. It's a charity organization meant to, I guess, prevent opportunities for sexual offenders to reoffend. And the goal of the organization, or one of the goals, is to just make sure that people with this type of criminal history are kept an eye on, like that we're making sure that they aren't going to do what they did again. The Allie Foundation also works in conjunction with, I guess, like a sailing charity in order to, you know, honor Allie in that regard as well, for something she loved to do. And that way, Allie Zapp will never, ever, ever be forgotten. A man is found beaten in his own apartment, and the police have the nerve to say he did it to himself. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Brandon Embry. Viewer discretion is advised. Brandon Embry was born on September 7th, 1986 in Louisville, Kentucky. He grew up in a military household. They moved around a lot. They moved around throughout the country to various different states, and then even at one point, they had lived in Italy. When Brandon was 18, after he graduated high school, he would actually enlist in the United States Navy. And he was a nuclear machinist mate in the Navy. And he was a petty officer, second class. After serving his time in the Navy, he was honorably discharged, and then he would go to Washington State. He would enroll in the Green River Community College, and this was located, I guess, a little south of Seattle. He would receive degrees in bioengineering and chemical pre-engineering. That all sounds way too smart for me to even possibly understand. He would then go to the University of Washington, where he would study he intended to become a pharmacist. But then, at some point, he decided to actually just move back to North Carolina, near his family. He would do, I guess, odd jobs, primarily as like a welder, and then he got his own apartment, and actually he ended up living in his own apartment, like in a couple different locations. But at the time of this case, he is living in an apartment on 711 South Church Street, and that is in Asheboro, North Carolina. Brandon's mom would describe him as a beautiful person in and out. He was astonishingly smart. He was someone who was very masterful with his words. He was really, really, really well spoken. He was also an introvert. I can relate. He liked to stay at home. He liked to just kind of relax peacefully with a good book. He was kind. He was well loved by everyone he knew. He also loved heavy metal music. He loved Viking culture. He had tattoos, with regards to like Viking culture. He did also attempt a few relationships with women, kind of here and there, but none of them seemed to last too long. And this all takes us to September 12th, 2019. That day, Brandon's mom, Sarah, and his sister, Rachel, they would go to Brandon's apartment just to pay him a visit, but mainly it's because they hadn't heard from him in a couple of days. A few days prior, on September 9th, 2019, Brandon and his mom were exchanging texts back and forth pretty consistently. And then on September 10th, at around 6:30 in the morning, his mom received the final text from Brandon. And after that, she never heard from him. Throughout that day, and then going into the following day on September 11th, she tried calling Brandon multiple times. His sister tried calling Brandon. They sent more text messages, but nothing was ever responded to. He never answered the phone. He never sent any texts back. So the mom and the sister go to his apartment complex. They see his truck parked in its normal spot. So they're like, okay, Brandon's home. So they go to his apartment, they knock on the door, he doesn't answer. They call out his name, no response. They knock more, nothing. They kind of listen in, they don't hear any sounds of anyone moving or anyone talking inside. They don't hear like a TV or anything. It's just silent. They even try calling his cell phone, just in case, but again, no answer. Now, they're a little scared. They're concerned. Something seems wrong. So they contact the Asheboro police. And when they arrive, they do tell police that Brandon has been feeling a little down. He had just recently lost a job just shortly before this. But at any rate, police are then knocking on the door, calling out his name. They get no response. And so they enlist the help of the apartment's complex management team and to come help open the door. And while they're there opening the door, they tell police that Brandon had recently put in his notice to, I guess, move out. Finally, inside the apartment, they notice that it is in complete disarray. Everything is just trash everywhere. It looked like some kind of altercation had maybe taken place. They also hear the sound of like water running, maybe a shower or a faucet going, which they would later determine was coming from Brandon's bathroom. As they go down the hall and they approach where Brandon's bedroom would be, they find him. He is on the ground. He is unconscious, it appears, and he is completely nude. He was on the floor, I guess, kind of outside the door to his room. He had cuts and lacerations. He had bruises to his head. There was a pool of blood underneath his head, and he had dried blood all over his face. He had dried blood on his hands. He had lacerations and cuts to his hands and his wrists. He was also still alive. They did detect a pulse, and he was starting to kind of make some noises like he was moaning, but he wasn't really waking up. So the ambulance obviously arrived, and they rushed him to the nearest hospital. But back at his apartment, his bedroom was just destroyed. I mean, it looked like a fight had broken out in this bedroom. All of his bed sheets were ripped off the bed. The bed sheets had blood on them. There was blood stains and blood spatter all over the mattress, on the walls. There was a nightstand that had been thrown over. There was blood on that. There was blood on the windowsill. There was blood on a closet door that had basically been ripped off of its frame and was kind of on the ground. The bathroom, it was the shower that was still running. The toilet was like ripped from the wall. The lid on the top of the tank had been pulled off and broken in half. The toilet, because it had been ripped from the wall, was like leaking everywhere. The mirror was shattered. I mean, this appeared that there had been some significant altercation or fight or something in this apartment, specifically in the bedroom and the bathroom. Back at Greensboro's Moses Cone Hospital, that's where Brandon was rushed to, investigators were photographing all of Brandon's injuries and seeing what other injuries he may have had that they didn't notice back at the crime scene. And that's when the hospital staff told him that Brandon also had some very severe injuries to his back. He had contusions and bruises on his back, and they said it was extremely consistent, as if someone had struck him in the back with a baseball bat or some kind of metal bar or pole or something like that. His nose was also completely fractured. The medical team there told police that these were injuries that they believed could not have been caused by himself. He could not have self-inflicted these injuries. It was of their opinion. His mom did tell the hospital staff that Brandon did have like ADHD. He had suffered from PTSD, and he was, a little bit depressed recently from losing his job. But they said, and all of his family members said, that there was never any indication, there was never any signs that Brandon would ever try to harm himself or end his own life. That's just something that was completely out of character for Brandon. He, despite being a little depressed, he still loved life, and he loved being alive, and he loved just sort of existing in the world. They said that Brandon, to their knowledge, didn't take any drugs. He did drink occasionally, but no more than, say, any other person would normally. And when they ran toxicology and, drug tests on him, they found zero traces of any illegal or recreational drugs in his system. Sadly, the day after he arrived at the hospital on September 13th, 2019, Brandon Embry was pronounced deceased. Brandon's mom and sister did tell police that Brandon did occasionally use like dating sites. They did tell police about the previous relationships he has had. And that's when the hospital receives a very strange phone call. A woman calls the hospital and claims to be someone named Ashley Embry, that she is Brandon's sister, and that she is the one to remain in contact with about all of this. That she did not want her mother to be involved in this. The problem? He didn't have a sister named Ashley. She didn't, what? So they then had to look into who this person was, which we'll get back to. In the meantime, police and crime scene investigators are going through Brandon's apartment, and I'll be showing some images, and you can see just sort of the nature of the crime scene and how kind of intense it was. When they searched the apartment, they collected 8 different swabs containing DNA. They collected a pair of handcuffs, a black iPhone, stuff they claimed was drug paraphernalia, and then they also found and collected several different hair fibers. Then, with a second search warrant, they searched his vehicle, and they searched the apartment more thoroughly. I guess the first search warrant didn't allow them to go as thoroughly as they wanted to. During this search, they find a hammer, but there's no blood on it. They do find a metal pipe that does have blood on it. Then there is reports that they found Brandon's wallet and keys in the bathroom. But then there's also reports that his wallet and keys were not found in the apartment at all. But later they would find crime scene photos that showed the wallet and keys in his apartment. Why there was conflicting reports on this, I don't know. They also found hypodermic needles, which Brandon had a prescription to use. They collected items of sexual nature, like bondage items, unopened cans of alcohol, and then they also found women's beauty products in the apartment as well. The truck was unlocked, which was unusual just because Brandon was always very particular, always made sure to make sure his vehicle was locked, as we pretty much all do. So they thought it was weird that it was unlocked, but it doesn't necessarily 100% prove anything. Maybe he just forgot. In terms of the front door of the apartment, it was locked. That's why they couldn't get in initially. But where Brandon was located and given his state, they don't feel that Brandon could have locked the door himself, that someone else had to have locked the door, more than likely with a key, because you couldn't lock it without a key from the front, obviously. Police noted there was no forced entry anywhere in the apartment. Something police did not disclose publicly, however, was that his house key, the door key, was missing from his keychain. They also couldn't find his spare key to the apartment. As a matter of fact, his family said that his spare apartment key was actually missing prior to this particular event, because Brandon had been in the hospital the previous February for just an unrelated issue, and they noticed his spare key was missing then. So, did his attacker take the keys or what? Police next go through Brandon's cell phone records. They do discover that there was a 13-minute call made on September 11th, 2019, and that was at 8:26 p.m. Police did not reveal this woman's name in any of their reports, but they did find the woman who the phone call went to, and her name was Olivia Doss, and that will come back up later as well. Because something happens now that's truly bizarre. The autopsy is done on September 16th, 2019. The medical examiner rules his death as natural. Natural. They said that Brandon had pneumonia with hypertensive cardiovascular disease. That all of the cuts on Brandon's body were just superficial cuts. And when the medical examiner did the autopsy, she did not make any note whatsoever about the injuries to Brandon's back. If you look at the diagram that the medical examiners have to fill out and basically mark on, the back was blank. So Brandon's mom, who had seen his back, and the medical professionals at the hospital had seen his back, she marked on the diagram, or on a different diagram, all of the injuries that happened to his back. The medical examiner also never went to the crime scene, ever, not once. She didn't see how the apartment looked. She didn't see, make note of the pole that had blood on it. She didn't see the disarray of the apartment to seem like a fight had broken out here. The crime scene was so evident that there was a fight. There was a major altercation. There was blood everywhere, all over his bedroom. There was a broken, the toilet lid, the broken mirror. I mean, it appeared to be a very violent crime scene. Then a few months later, she makes changes to the autopsy report. She's saying the hypoxia and organ damage and whatnot that was caused to his body was likely from substance ingestion that had metabolized and was no longer in his bloodstream at the time of the autopsy. I guess she's just guessing. So now she changes the cause of death to undetermined. She said if there was provable substance ingestion, then the cause of death would be accidental. But then noted it's still possible the cause of death is natural. What? And then apparently one of the detectives or someone investigating the case wrote, "I am unable to prove that a criminal offense has occurred. The apartment was secured, no signs of forced entry, no sign of a robbery." And the kicker, no signs of foul play. No signs of it. And they closed the case. And so the detectives ordered the evidence to be destroyed. In 2021, his mom, I guess, managed to get some sort of overview or review of the case done. She thinks that someone may have poisoned him with antifreeze, and that Brandon had actually had chemical burns inside of his mouth. The medical examiner, this brilliant medical examiner who definitely deserves to have her job, said there were no signs of any of that. The reason why she thinks this is because I guess a few months prior to this, Brandon was in the hospital, and there were these crystallized things, I guess, found in his system or in his mouth or something that would indicate some kind of antifreeze poisoning, which something he survived from. His mom also made note that the injuries around his wrists were indicative that someone had restrained him with something like handcuffs, which handcuffs they found in his apartment. But the brilliant medical examiner during the initial autopsy said, no, not consistent with handcuffs. Mm-mm. His mom also said, hey, the injuries and stuff to his head, probably caused by that broken toilet lid. And his mom said, which is evident because of all of the blood, and he lost so much blood. But then the medical examiner said, he didn't really lose that much blood, no. When the crime scene photos show his blood all over the bedroom, his face was covered in blood. He didn't lose that much blood. Mm-mm. And again, the officials on the case just kind of say, no, there's just no sign of homicide here. Mm-mm, sorry, none. Brandon's mom has a suspect in mind. A woman. Her name is Cassandra Welch Gainey. Brandon had met her early in 2019. Shortly after meeting this woman, Brandon would be hospitalized numerous times throughout 2019 before his death, with a lot of acute abdominal pain, vomiting, a lot of just very mysterious and sudden illnesses. And like I said, at one point in the hospital, he had those crystallized things found in his system that would indicate possible antifreeze poisoning. This all occurred after meeting this particular woman through a dating app. Brandon beforehand was not someone who really ever got sick. He was always a very healthy person. And then all of a sudden he's sick like many, many times in 1 year, all after meeting her. So Brandon's mom told police about this woman. So during the initial investigation, police said, okay, fine, we'll interview her. But then she got scared to do the interview. She said, well, maybe they know something that they might try to pin it on me. And then on the day or around the time she was supposed to be interviewed, she suddenly fell sick. She said she got food poisoning. And she kept pushing back the interview a few times. And then finally, in December of 2019, she finally came in for an interview. They find out that Cassandra is still a married woman, and she was seeing Brandon on the side. She had traveled to Asheboro to hang out with and meet Brandon several times. She showed them her text messages between the two of them. She said, I loved him very much. So they asked her where she was the nights that Brandon died, and she says, I was home in bed, sick. They asked her, well, do you know how he died? Do you have any knowledge of how he died? And she said, I can't answer that. She was asking police questions like, where exactly did you find Brandon? And they're like, in his apartment. Then she's like, but where specifically in his apartment did you find him? And they were like, we can't divulge all this information to you. But she was really trying to press them for information for some reason. She said the last time she saw Brandon was in early September of 2019, so shortly before his death. And then she had traveled back to Asheboro a week after he died because she hadn't heard from him. So she said she traveled to find out what happened to him. She then said, she told police during this interview, she goes, I called police a couple times to find out what happened to him, and that's how I found out he died. But then when police looked up records of phone calls from her to the police station, there was none. There was no calls ever that came in during the time frame she said she had called, and no calls from her, any of her known phone numbers. When police said, hey, can we have your phone to pull data from it? And she said yes. During this interview, she's literally on her phone. Apparently, it looks like she's trying to maybe delete things from her phone before she gives it up. And then when police finally got the phone from her, when they tried to pull up her GPS information as to where she was, that information was suddenly gone, as if someone had deleted it completely from the phone. So initially, there's one detective who's working on the case who actually appeared to be investigating this case. He was the one who actually noted, the injuries on Brandon's back. He was the one who actually interviewed this Cassandra person. But then, for some reason, another detective took over, and once the autopsy was done, it's almost like this new detective and the medical examiner were working together to make sure this wasn't ruled a homicide for some reason, because then the initial detective was now off the case for reasons I don't know. So police want to question Cassandra's husband. His name is Danny. Their relationship was really not that great. It was very rocky. And the crazy thing, Danny told police that he himself had been unusually ill for a time. And then during when he and Cassandra were still together, towards the end of their relationship, I guess. And then suddenly his health improved after she finally left him. So Danny, I guess, had known one of Cassandra's ex-boyfriends. And so he asked that gentleman, had you ever been sick when dating her? And he said, yes. I was violently ill all the time. And then we could never explain why. But then after our relationship was over, I was fine. Yeah, that's called a bit of a history. So Brandon's mom, basically, because police aren't doing anything now, she basically starts investigating herself. She finds out that Cassandra had purchased high amounts of something called diphenhydramine, which is a substance that was found in Brandon's system back when his blood was tested around his death. I guess this is something commonly found in Benadryl. The traces that were found in Brandon's system were definitely higher than they should have been for someone just kind of casually taking Benadryl. High amounts of Benadryl can lead to things like heart failure, seizures, could put you in a coma, it could cause you to die. So Brandon's mom believes, and I understand why, that Cassandra had been drugging him, and also her husband and other boyfriends. But Cassandra isn't like this overly gigantic person, and Brandon's a big guy. And so she's like, okay, well, Cassandra couldn't have just done this all on her own. I mean, this was a violent crime scene. And then that's when Olivia Doss comes back in. Because remember, there was a 13-minute phone call from Brandon's cell phone to a person named Olivia Doss the night before his body was found. Brandon and Olivia, it turns out, had also met through a dating site just a few weeks before his death. Apparently, the two of them only ever physically met once, but they spoke on the phone through text or phone calls nearly every single day since they met. When Olivia was asked, because, that phone call, she said the last time I talked to him was September 9th when I was driving home from work. She said Brandon was super happy. He seemed to be very joyful, full of life. And Cassandra had said that her and Brandon were actively dating when this Olivia Doss person came into play. And so when she found out about that, she's like, well, that's kind of weird. But at any rate, Olivia said the last time she talked to him was September 9th, but there's a phone call proven on September 11th, the night before he is found dead. She says that, I didn't talk to him. So, a theory, maybe. Could the two women have found out about each other and somehow took it all out on Brandon, right? Because maybe he was trying to talk to two different women at once. It's kind of established, right? This Cassandra person may have the ability to poison people, right? With high levels of Benadryl. Every time she seems to date someone or marry someone, they are in the hospital many, many times. And then suddenly when they break up, they're no longer in the hospital. And why did Olivia Doss lie about not talking to him the night before his body was found? It was a 13-minute phone call. This wasn't a voicemail, it was a call. So was she hiding something? But police closed the case. They said no foul play detected. Despite these two women being in the picture, despite all of the circumstantial evidence to suggest maybe we should thoroughly investigate them, despite both of them had lied about certain things, and when the family of Brandon looked more into Cassandra, they found more lies. Apparently, she initially told Brandon that she was from Russia. Not true. She was originally from Maine. Never been to Russia. She also told him she had all these medical issues, which none of that turned out to be true. She said she had a nursing degree. Nope, she didn't. She told Brandon's family, I guess, that, I had a baby when I was 14. The baby died. They investigated this. Not true. Cassandra is this pathological liar, and she lied about everything, and she manipulated people. She even at one point was caught using other people's cell phones to pretend to be them to speak to other people. So does that mean Cassandra was the one to call the hospital and say, hey, I'm his sister Rachel, which never existed, to get them to stop talking to the family? Maybe. And then did she somehow meet Olivia Doss and convince her to be involved in this kind of plan to do something to Brandon? What was her motives? What was the reasons for doing this? What would benefit her for doing this to Brandon? What benefits her to do this to her other boyfriends and her husband? Kind of unclear. But for the police to sit here and say this was either an accidental death or this was a natural death is absolutely absurd. But why would they want to cover all of this up? What's the benefit to them to say, nope, this was an accident, nope, this was natural? What's the point? Why not investigate this as it appears to be? How can they say there's no foul play? The apartment looks like the typical foul play crime scene. Blood everywhere. Things smashed and broken. He had injuries all over his body. Why would the coroner lie about the injuries on his back? Why not even reveal them? What's the point of that? Why are they trying to cover it up? There is so much about this case that absolutely screams homicide, that this man was murdered. I mean, they're here trying to suggest that he beat himself up, that he caused all of this. Due to some what? Reactions to some kind of medication? Or are they trying to say his own mental health issues caused him to beat the ever-living crap out of himself? Break his own nose? How would he beat himself in the back with a baseball bat or a metal pole? Smash something over his head like a toilet bowl lid? It doesn't make sense. They're saying he basically beat himself to death, essentially is what they're saying. But that it happened naturally. Doesn't make sense. That's not logical. What are they saying? He somehow, slammed himself into things around his apartment? Slammed his face maybe into just into walls or the mirror and punched himself? Like, what are they suggesting happened here? To me and to many people, it's pretty evident that this man was murdered. He was killed by someone. Was it Cassandra? It's unlikely she did this on her own. So did she have the help of this Olivia Doss person? Maybe, but that's only allegedly. We can't actually say that for a fact. Did Cassandra hire some male individual to help her with beating him up? Did Olivia and Cassandra hire someone to help them both? Only if police would have actually investigated and looked into this at all. But as of right now, as the time of this video in 2023, his case is still closed, and it's still ruled an accidental death, or an undetermined death, I should say. Police aren't giving the phone records to his family. They're refusing to hand it over, despite destroying other evidence, and despite saying this case is closed, they won't hand over the records. They want to get into Brandon's laptop, but it's password protected, and they're trying to still find a way to getting into it. And actually, why would they destroy evidence if they ruled his death now as undetermined? Why are they destroying evidence? So you just have to wonder, what's the police motive here? Do they have connections to these women or to one of the women? And maybe, who knows? It's not necessarily impossible that Cassandra could have drugged him to the point where he wasn't moving, and so maybe she then just beat the crap out of him when he was just sort of passed out on the ground, and then destroyed his apartment to make it look like, who knows? There's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of questions about this, but the one thing that I feel is definite is that he was murdered. I think that's very clear, and that's also, it seems to be very clear, the police want nothing to do with investigating this as a homicide, but the question is why. I do know the family wants to file a wrongful death lawsuit against Cassandra. I'm not sure what the status is on that, though. Now, I would normally say at this point, because this case is still unsolved, it is technically unsolved. I always say, someone somewhere out there knows the truth, and perhaps that someone is you, right? And then I would say, contact the local police department. But in this case, maybe don't do that. If you are out there and you do know something about this case, I would recommend actually going to the Facebook page called Brandon's Voice. Brandon's Voice, the murder and cover-up of Brandon Embry. I believe it's ran by his mom or someone in his family. And so maybe join that group if you have information, and maybe try to reach out to them directly with information you have. And maybe they can get this information to a private investigator or whatever the case may be. I would probably say in this case, don't go to police, because it doesn't sound like they have any interest in helping. Brandon Embry was a normal, happy guy. Sure, he had mental health issues like depression, recent depression. He had PTSD. A lot of people do. And most of them don't beat themselves to death with having... It just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. He was someone who loved life. He loved to read. He loved his family. And they are convinced he would never do anything to hurt himself. So Brandon Embry, as of right now, has been failed by the justice system. And he and his family, they deserve proper justice. And Brandon and his family deserve peace and the knowledge of who did this and why. And they deserve to have that person or persons prosecuted. So if you have anything that can help this family get the closure they deserve, please reach out to them. Once again, I have yet another case where an innocent person went to prison for a crime he did not commit. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Angie Dodge. Viewer discretion is advised. Angie Dodge was born on December 21st, 1977, and she was born in Vancouver, Washington. But by the time this case occurs, she's actually living in Idaho, specifically in Idaho Falls. Angie was described as a force to be reckoned with. She loved and cared for her friends so much that if someone were to get into one of her friends' faces, she would be right there defending them. She was someone who would absolutely take care of her friends. Angie was incredibly intelligent, very, very smart. She was fun-loving. She was an incredibly responsible young woman at the age of 18. And one of her friends would just say that she was this big, bright character of a person. When this case, occurred, according to Angie's mom, Carol, Carol said that Angie, she truly was a very independent person. She was wanting independence. Angie would tell her mom, just let me grow up. Let me make my own mistakes. You don't need to be my shadow. And that's because she was just a fiercely independent person, but had a very close relationship with her mom. So at the time, Angie is a college student and she's living in her own apartment. On June 13th, 1996, just a few weeks after she moved into this apartment, Angie was found brutally killed inside of it. Angie had been raped and then stabbed to death. This was an incredibly bloody crime scene. There was blood smeared on the walls. She had this teddy bear near her body that was just soaked in blood. Angie's clothing had been, her shirt had been pulled up and her sweats had been pulled down. They found bloody handprints on Angie's body. They also found semen with her body. And by 1996, DNA technology had advanced enough where they were able to, put that in somewhere and to match to a suspect, but they needed a suspect first. From what I understand, the rest of the apartment was in pretty good condition. There wasn't any extreme signs of a struggle. There wasn't really any forced entry. And at first, investigating this case, the Idaho Falls police were just having a really difficult time with it. The summer that came and it went, it wouldn't be until the early 1997 when they had what they thought was a break. A man named Benjamin Hobbs had been arrested in Nevada. He had raped a woman, but also used a knife to inflict, injury on this victim who survived. And I guess Benjamin Hobbs at one point ran in the same circle that Angie did. So police bring in Hobbs to question him with regards to the murder of Angie. And through those conversations, he mentions the name of a man named Christopher Tapp, a 20-year-old who was also friendly with Angie and was in that circle of friends. So what they did was they brought in this Christopher Tapp person, and I think they wanted to do that in order to get more evidence against Hobbs. They were going to be looking at Hobbs as the main suspect. So on January 7th, 1997, Christopher Tapp was brought in for questioning and then he was released. Then on January 10th, he comes back in for more interviews. Then they let him go and they said, we need to come back again tomorrow. But this time, Christopher Tapp was like, I'm going to get a lawyer first before I come back for a third time. because, and by the way, asking for a lawyer does not mean you're guilty. A lot of people seem to think that, but it means that you're just protecting yourself because police have been known to coerce confessions out of people. So you should always have a lawyer. Always call for or ask for a lawyer right off the bat. So police go to Christopher Tapp's home and says, hey, is he willing to come back in? And his mom says, well, he will, but he will come back with a lawyer. So in the interview he did when his lawyer was present, he then says that neither him or Benjamin Hobbs had anything to do with the murder of Angie Dodge. But then he changes his story. He said that Hobbs had killed Angie and had come to him, Christopher Tapp, to provide a false alibi. Then on January 15th, during another interview with Christopher Tapp, he changes the story again. This time he says that he was with Hobbs when Hobbs killed Angie. And he said the reason why he killed Angie was because Angie was trying to break up the marriage, I guess, that Benjamin had with his wife. Now, most of these interviews are being recorded, which thankfully they were. And for some reason, his attorney did not sit in the room. He was instead in the other room looking through the glass. One of the people who actually interrogated Christopher Tapp was a former school resource officer that was at the school that Christopher Tapp and Angie and all them had gone to. And so this, who's now a police officer, he's now using it like, oh, hey, remember me? And like to get, Christopher comfortable talking to him. By January 15th through the 17th, they had been working on getting immunity agreements for Christopher Tapp that if you can provide us the information that helps lead to getting Benjamin Hobbs for this, and it has to be truthful, you will be immune from prosecution. And that he would be potentially prosecuted for aiding and abetting, but not for murder and not for rape. So now, on January 18th, he is interviewed again. This time, however, they finally get back a DNA sample. So they took Christopher's DNA, because he had provided it, to compare to the DNA found, which was semen, found on Angie, was not a match, was not his. It also did not come back to Benjamin Hobbs. And so this is when detectives do something strange. I guess they found out about another mutual friend of theirs named Jeremy Sargis, and they were trying to tell Christopher, okay, well, maybe this Jeremy person was also involved. And so now Christopher Tapp changes his story. Now he's saying that, okay, it was Hobbs and Sargis that raped and killed Angie. I was just there. But then they got DNA sample from Sargis, and on January 27th, DNA was not a match. So far, they've got 3 men that they are thinking were involved in this. The DNA matches none of them. And that is the only physical evidence they have to connect the killer to, the victim. And now that there's more people involved, the prosecution's apparently they're annoyed with Christopher because the story's always been changing and they feel like he's not telling the truth. And so right there in front of him, they basically void his immunity deal. He wasn't getting immunity anymore. That's when police decide to take Christopher Tapp for some ungodly reason. They take him to the actual crime scene, and his lawyer did not go with him. He elected to not go. Okay. So now at the crime scene, Christopher Tapp changed his story again. He's saying, okay, I was there and I was holding Angie down during the rape and during the actual stabbing, but I did not do it myself. I just held her down. He's also saying that Hobbs was the one who was still there raping and killing her, and now he's saying Sargis had no involvement whatsoever. He wasn't there, despite accusing him in a previous conversation with police. Christopher Tapp took not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 polygraph tests. And during these polygraph tests, police told him that if he takes them, they can give him a much more lenient sentence. They also said, if convicted, you can get the death penalty for this. And once he was done with the tests, they told him, they said, all right, well, it appears you're being relatively truthful, but you are also being deceptive on some answers with regards to your involvement in the murder. They were lying to him. On February 3rd, Christopher Tapp was arrested, charged with first-degree murder, rape, and use of a deadly weapon in the commission of a felony, and he was the only one charged in the connection with Angie Dodge's case. Benjamin Hobbs was no longer being charged as to do anything with this case, and Mr. Sargis also was not being charged with anything to do with this case. So now it's all just on Christopher Tapp. Despite him not being the initial suspect, Hobbs being the suspect, they've now been able to finagle this whole thing to put it all on Christopher. And they have a recorded confession, right, on video. And his lawyer was trying to get that confession not admitted as evidence because they feel that there was some coercion going on. They lied to Christopher Tapp on a number of occasions, saying that you're going to get the death penalty this, you're going to get the gas chamber. We'll give you immunity if you can tell the truth about other people involved. And so they go to trial. And, you know, from the outside looking in, everyone believes the police have done their work, that they have got the right guy, and this should end in a guilty verdict. And the confession tapes, all the police interviews, were pretty much the primary source of evidence in this case. There was no physical evidence, no hair, no blood, the semen, nothing. No physical evidence linked back to Christopher Tapp or any of the other two suspects. They had no physical evidence at all. No fingerprints, nothing. Shoe impressions, nothing. Boot prints, nothing. And his defense was trying to argue, like, well, listen, the police were really focused on Benjamin Hobbs, like he was their guy. And then all of a sudden they shifted to Christopher Tapp, probably because he was more easily manipulated, that he was under an extreme amount of pressure while doing these interviews. And this is not a scenario he's ever been involved in before. Now, along with the confessions, the prosecution introduced testimony from a woman named Destiny Osborne. She said that she was at a party a few days after Dodge was killed, and that she overheard Taps and Hobbs talking about the crime. And this Destiny Osborne person also acknowledged and admitted she was very high on drugs during this particular time at this party. And she said that she overheard them saying that Angie Dodge was killed because she owed them money for meth, which wasn't true. There was no drugs in Angie's system, and she never had done drugs. Now, Christopher Tapp did not testify. However, they did bring forth witnesses who actually confirmed Christopher's alibi for the entire time in question. But basically, the prosecution was like, she was just mistaken on the time. That's it. Can you prove that? No, we can't prove it, but she's lying, or she misremembered the time. And with no evidence, with a very up and down history with these confessions, with the police conversations and him never having the same story, him getting information wrong, by the way, with regards to the layout of Angie's apartment and the crime itself. Despite that, again, this jury, they said he was guilty. They convicted him. And he was sentenced in 1998. He was sentenced to life in prison with a parole period after 30 years for the murder. And then he got an additional 10 years for the rape charge. There would be a number of appeals. He would appeal over and over and over again, and he would lose every single one. There was arguments that he may have had diminished mental capacity at the time. He didn't truly understand what was going on, which again, police in these situations who don't want to be bothered to put in the actual work, just find an easy scapegoat and say, okay, well, we can get this guy to admit he did it. That way we can just, do this with it. They brought up that his Miranda rights had been violated. But again, the courts were like, no, they weren't. So by 2007, the Idaho Innocence Project would take on Christopher Tapp's case. Something really powerful to note here is that at the trial and when the verdict was read, Angie's mom, Carol, believed that they got one of the right guys. That he had to, they got him, he was guilty. She was happy about him going away forever. But she always had these little thoughts that more people might be involved. And the reason why I say it's powerful is because much later on, Carol Dodge becomes one of Christopher's biggest champions to get him out of jail. So when the Innocence Project takes it on, the Idaho Innocence Project, they push to have more DNA testing done on the clothing Angie was in that night, not just the semen they found, because they still have that sample. They wanted to test DNA found on the blood-soaked teddy bear. And ultimately, what was found out with testing for DNA on all of these items was that the DNA profile they have of the suspect, it only came back to being one person. So the DNA found on the clothing, the DNA with the semen, the DNA found on the teddy bear, all of it was only from one contributor that wasn't Angie Dodge. Meaning this idea that 2 or 3 people may have been involved was increasingly unlikely. That only one person did this. And so Carol Dodge, who was initially pushing for the death penalty for Christopher, well, now she's gone back and she's watched all of the interrogation footage. She contacts a leading expert in false confessions and coerced confessions, and she gets them to watch all of the confession tapes and the interview tapes. They were able to determine that Christopher Tapp's confessions were coerced. He was pressured into doing it, and he was lied to about extreme penalties. And so that'll make a person go, oh, okay, I don't want that. So what do you need me to do? And so now, armed with this DNA evidence that the DNA only comes from one possible person that does not match Hobbs, that does not match Sargis, and does not match the guy actually convicted, Christopher Tapp. And you have now the mother of the victim saying, okay, he was coerced. This was a bullshit confession. You have actual legal confession experts stating that that confession was coerced and he was lied to. That Christopher Tapp's confessions did not match the crime scene, did not match, he didn't know the layout of the apartment, like I said earlier. Most of the stuff he said he was guessing and maybe got right, or other things he was guessing and he got wrong. And so there's all sorts of stuff pointing to somebody else doing this, and they have the wrong guy. So by 2017, what basically happens is the court systems says, okay, we're going to vacate the rape conviction altogether, but the murder conviction still stands because the non-semen DNA, just because it doesn't match him, doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't there. They're still going with that. Then in 2017, the witness from earlier, this Mrs. Osborne, who testified that she overheard them talking about killing Angie, well, she now recants her entire statement. She says she didn't even know Benjamin Hobbs, that the police threatened her. They were going to threaten to arrest her on drug charges unless she came up with some answers for them. So, yeah, but again, the murder conviction still stood. And now at that point, they're having, they're processing all the DNA through the familial DNA system. And I guess at one point, this attempt to go through like ancestry websites for DNA, it actually led them to a man named Michael Usry Jr., who was a filmmaker. But something was like, so he was basically accused of being involved in this, even though he had no connection to Angie. But then once they actually took his DNA and compared it to the DNA found, again, wasn't a match to this guy. And he did have a little bit of like, well, shit, you've just basically told people that I was possibly involved in this, and so now that's going to screw my life over. Now in 2018, they have gained more momentum. So now they're using the Parabon nanolabs and using the familial DNA to see if they can find another suspect. And it helps lead them to a man named Brian Drips, a man who actually lived across the street from Angie Dodge and who was actually questioned by police early on in the investigation. And they never really pursued him because they felt like Hobbs was the guy. They felt like Sargis was the guy. They felt like Christopher Tapp was the guy. And so they kind of just interviewed this Brian Drips guy and said, okay, bye. So the Idaho Falls police first would follow him because they needed to make sure it was his DNA. So they finally tracked him and they saw him discard his cigarettes and spit and all that. So they collected it and they ran that through, DNA testing to compare to the DNA at the crime scene, and it was a match. So on May 15th, 2019, Brian Drips was brought in for questioning, and he's also given him his direct DNA sample. And once again, it is a 100% match. It matched Brian Drips. He was the contributor of all of the DNA at the crime scene. And then once the police told him that, he confessed. He didn't coerce in this one. They said, listen, we got your DNA. It's at the crime scene. What do you want to say? I did it. He said he acted alone. He didn't even know Christopher Tapp. He had never met him before. He didn't know Hobbs. He didn't know Sargis. He didn't know any of them. And he really barely knew Angie. She just lived across the street from him. And so this now completely exonerates Christopher Tapp. On July 17, 2019, Christopher Tapp's murder conviction was vacated. So that was no longer on his record. Christopher Tapp would try to go on to live his life, and he wanted to be an advocate for people in this situation that he's been in. Sadly, in November of 2023, Christopher Tapp was killed. He was in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I guess he got into some kind of fight with someone, which led to Christopher being murdered. He was actually killed by a former congressional candidate and a former wrestler, I guess. And the man's name was Daniel Rodimer. Currently, Mr. Rodimer is facing a murder charge, but that has not gone to trial yet. I believe it's expected to go to trial sometime here in 2025. But Christopher Tapp lost, about 20 years of his life sitting in a prison cell for something he didn't do. He's finally released, and just a few short years later, he's murdered. He never got a chance to actually live his life, not fully. And I just think it's just, you know, it's obviously incredibly frustrating with cases like this. It's just, you wish they would just say, listen, let's put the actual work in to find this killer. Let's not do the lazy thing and just find someone who looks like they could have done it, and we'll just make sure we can finagle it so that everyone believes they did it. You know, the public will trust us. The family of the victim will trust us. And that's the thing, is, you know, her mom, Carol, believed in the police what they did at that time. She trusted them to get this done. And by all accounts, they got it done. Then she realized they didn't. And she went from wanting the death penalty for her daughter's alleged killer to wanting to help free that man. And she played a huge role in getting his case pushed to the right people. So it was really her who got this done. And the Innocence Project, of course, as well. And that's pretty amazing. I think that's incredibly commendable. And so, you know, it may have taken a while, and it may have gone down the wrong path for a while, but finally, in the end, Angie Dodge, her mom, and Christopher Tapp, really, all got the justice they very rightfully deserved. But that is it for this case, True Crime, a Rudy Dingleberry Dongs. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, please subscribe to the channel if you like true crime. Hi, my name is Mike. I tell these stories multiple times a week on here. So please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment, because that helps more people see it. Make sure you hit the bell to be notified when I post new videos. Please watch the videos all the way through if you can. That also helps a lot. I also tell short form true crime stories over on TikTok. The link to my TikTok is in the description of this video below in the link tree. I tell the short form true crime stories there, but I also post all of those from the previous month in a big old compilation video at the beginning of the next month. Also in that link tree, you're going to find my case list. It's over 7,000 names now. I pick my cases at random usually, so if you want to recommend a case to me that you don't see on that list, just send me a quick email, also listed below, with the name of the case, where it happened, and when it happened, and I'll make sure it's added to the list. If you are a loved one to a murdered victim or a missing person, let me know in your email so I can make sure that case becomes a higher priority, if you would like it to be. But with that is it for this video, True Crime Maroonies. So until the next case, ta-ta for now. Whoa. And to finish this video, let's do a round of live, laugh, lose, huh? Not a sponsor, but I have this game where you have to read a joke, a dad joke basically, and you have to do it in whatever the delivery card is. All right, let's see what we got. Oh shit, this is kind of perfect actually. Read the joke in Batman's voice. Here's the joke. How does a penguin build its house? It glues it together. It glues it together because it's a penguin. The penguin is... How stupid. How stupid. Okay, well, I can't stop doing the voice. Goodbye, everyone! Let's try to give you a chuckle. Why do bananas have to put on sunscreen before they go to the beach? I hate this. I hate this so much. Because they might peel. Okay, let's try one more because that was the stupidest thing I've ever heard. What did Obi-Wan say when Luke was having trouble eating at a Chinese restaurant? Oh, for fuck's sakes. Use the fork. I hate my life. I hate that I ever had to tell those jokes. And, sincerely apologize. I hope you will forgive me. Find it in your heart to forgive me. Please do not call the police to report me for a hate crime, because those both were hate crimes, and I apologize immensely. I will issue a public apology if need be. Goodbye.